They isolated me in a Tuscan villa, no phone, no internet, just Eleanor's pitying smiles and locked doors. My younger wife played the devoted caretaker beautifully, telling neighbors my dementia required containment. What she didn't know, I was fully lucid, watching her pack my diplomatic credentials into shipping containers. She was building an empire on smuggled assets, using my immunity as her shield. I let her think the garden was my world. But while I pruned roses, I was pruning her future. The morning it crystallized, I was in the garden cutting back the climbers that had overgrown the south wall. The shears were old carbon steel, heavy in my grip, the wooden handles worn smooth by decades of use. My hands worked automatically while my ears tracked the conversation happening in the villa's dining room. The windows were open. Eleanor thought I was too senile to understand English anymore. She spoke loudly, confidently, the way people talk around the elderly and the broken. Marco's voice was gravel and cigarettes. He was showing her photographs on his tablet, shipping manifests from Livorno port. My diplomatic credentials were listed as the customs exemption. Artworks, Eleanor said, her voice bright with greed. 16th-century Venetian pieces being repatriated to a private collection in Geneva. Marco laughed, a wet sound that made my jaw tighten. They were trafficking narcotics in crates marked as diplomatic cargo. My immunity made the shipments invisible to customs. She'd been building this network for 8 months while spoon-feeding me pills and telling the housekeeper my memory was failing. I trimmed another branch. The steel bit through the wood with a clean snap. I counted my heartbeats. 72 per minute. Steady. Controlled. Eleanor had made one critical error in her operational planning. She assumed that silence meant consent, that patience meant ignorance. She'd forgotten what I did for 40 years before I retired to this villa. Ambassadors don't survive in hostile territories by being naive. We survive by being patient, by watching, by building files. And by always, maintaining a fail-safe. The tool shed behind the villa smelled of mineral oil and dried lavender. I locked the door behind me, testing the handle twice. Old habit. The workbench was pine, scarred with decades of cuts and burns, the surface uneven from use. I sat on the stool, feeling the knots in the wood press into my spine. My hands were trembling now that no one was watching. Not from fear. From the effort of suppression. I kept my operational resources in a watertight case buried beneath the third flagstone from the door. Inside was a satellite phone, a portable hard drive, and a handwritten ledger documenting every conversation I'd overheard, every suspicious transaction I'd photographed through windows, every license plate of every courier who'd visited the villa. The hard drive contained copies of Eleanor's financial records, shipping invoices, and video files from the security camera I'd installed in the wine cellar where she held her planning meetings. She never checked for cameras. She thought I was too addled to operate technology. The satellite phone had one number programmed into it. My former attaché at State Department Counterintelligence, a woman named Sarah Vance who'd worked the Balkans during the trafficking wars. I'd sent her encrypted updates every 72 hours for the past 3 months. She was building a case, waiting for my signal. But there was another mechanism in play. The dead man's switch. A server-based system I'd configured before Eleanor began her medication campaign. Every 72 hours, I logged into a secure portal and reset a countdown timer. If I failed to reset it, the system auto-transmitted a complete evidence package to State Department investigators, the Italian Guardia di Finanza, and Interpol. Financial records. Shipping manifests. Video recordings. Photographs of Marco, of Eleanor, of the entire operation. The system was elegant. Mechanical. It required no judgment, no emotion, only the passage of time. Eleanor thought she'd isolated me. She'd actually built her own cage. I returned to the garden after lunch, moving with the shuffling gait Eleanor expected. She was watching from the terrace, her phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gesturing sharply. She wore white linen that morning, expensive fabric that hung wrong on her frame because she'd lost weight from stress. Guilt has a metabolism. She ended the call when I approached the terrace steps, her face shifting into the practiced mask of concern she wore like a uniform. "Winston, darling," she said, her voice sugared with false warmth. "You've been in the sun too long. Come inside and rest." I blinked at her slowly, letting my mouth hang slightly open. I shuffled toward the shade, gripping my cane with both hands as though it were the only thing keeping me upright. She guided me to a chair, her hand on my elbow, her touch light and clinical. She brought me water in a crystal glass, the ice cubes clinking softly. I watched her face as I drank. She was calculating something behind those pale eyes. "The shipment," she said carefully, speaking slowly as if to a child. "The one Marco mentioned. We need to finalize the customs documents. Your signature is required." I stared at her blankly. She sighed, a theatrical sound, and produced a folder from the side table. Inside were official customs declarations, forms I'd signed 1,000 times during my career. She'd already filled in the details. Diplomatic immunity. Personal effects. Repatriation of cultural property. All lies. I took the pen she offered. My hand shook convincingly. I signed Winston Churchill III in a trembling scrawl that barely resembled my actual signature. She smiled, relieved, and kissed my forehead. "Good," she whispered. "You're doing so well." She thought she'd won. She thought the signature was consent, compliance, proof of my incapacity. What she didn't realize was that I'd just created legal evidence of forgery. My actual signature was controlled, precise, the muscle memory of 4 decades. The trembling scrawl I'd just produced would never pass forensic analysis. I'd just handed her the rope. Marco arrived at the villa 3 days later driving a black Mercedes that left oily smoke hanging in the driveway. He wore a leather jacket despite the heat, gold chains visible at his throat. Eleanor greeted him at the door with the folder of signed documents, her face bright with triumph. I watched from my chair in the sitting room, positioned where I could see the entryway through the half-open door. They didn't bother closing it fully. I was furniture to them now, irrelevant and harmless. Marco examined the signatures, holding them up to the light. He grunted approval. "Your husband is very cooperative when medicated properly," he said, his English thick with Balkan consonants. Eleanor laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "He doesn't even remember his own name half the time," she said. "By next month, I'll have him declared incompetent. The power of attorney is already drafted. Then we expand operations. Libya route, Syria if the borders stabilize. With full diplomatic cover, we can move 10 times the volume." Marco lit a cigarette, the smoke curling toward the ceiling. "And the old man?" he asked, exhaling. "What happens to him after the declaration?" Eleanor's voice dropped, but I heard it clearly. My hearing aids were set to maximum amplification, the audio feedback a thin whine only I could detect. "There's a care facility in Switzerland," she said. "Very private. Very permanent. He'll be comfortable and completely isolated. No visitors, no communication. He'll just fade away quietly while we build the network." Marco nodded, flicking ash onto the marble floor. "You are cold, woman," he said, but there was admiration in his tone. Eleanor smiled. "I learned from the best," she said. "Now let's finalize the shipping schedule before the customs window closes." They moved to the dining room, spreading maps and manifests across the table. I remained in my chair, head tilted as if sleeping, my hands folded in my lap. But my thumb was moving beneath the blanket across my lap, pressing the record button on the digital recorder I kept in my cardigan pocket. Every word. Every admission. Every piece of evidence captured in high-definition audio. At 4:17 that afternoon, 71 hours and 43 minutes after my last reset, I made my decision. I did not log into the dead man's switch portal. I let the countdown run to 0. The knock on the villa door came at 9:32 the next morning. I was in the garden again, my habitual position, my safe camouflage. Eleanor answered, still in her silk robe, her hair uncombed. Through the open terrace doors, I heard her voice shift from irritation to confusion to something very close to panic. She called for Marco. He emerged from the guest bedroom, barefoot, his shirt unbuttoned. They stood together in the doorway facing 4 men and 2 women in dark suits. The lead investigator was a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back severely. She spoke Italian with a Roman accent, clear and formal. "Signora Churchill, I am Colonel Adriana Costa of the Guardia di Finanza. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of trafficking in controlled substances, abuse of diplomatic immunity, conspiracy to commit fraud, and forgery of official documents. We also have a European arrest warrant for Marco Petric on related charges. Eleanor's mouth opened and closed, no sound emerging. Marco took one step backward, calculating escape routes, but two of the male officers moved to block him. Colonel Costa continued, her voice flat and procedural. We have comprehensive evidence including financial records, shipping manifests, video surveillance, and audio recordings documenting your conspiracy. Additionally, Ambassador Winston Churchill III has provided voluntary testimony and documentary evidence as a cooperating witness. Eleanor turned, her eyes finding me across the terrace. I stood slowly, setting down my pruning shears with deliberate care. I walked toward her, my gait steady, no shuffle, no tremor. I looked her directly in the eyes. My voice, when I spoke, was level and clear. Every word enunciated with diplomatic precision. The signatures you obtained under false pretenses have been analyzed, I said. The forgery is documented. The medication you administered to induce cognitive impairment has been tested and catalogued. Your conspiracy with Mr. Petric has been under surveillance for 97 days. Every shipment. Every communication. Every transaction. You used my credentials to traffic narcotics through 6 countries. You planned to have me declared incompetent and institutionalized. You documented your intentions in recorded conversations. You built your entire operation on the assumption that I was broken. Eleanor's face drained of color. She looked like something carved from soap, her features melting in the morning heat. You were supposed to be, she whispered, her voice fractured. The dementia. The medication. You couldn't even remember what day it was. I never forgot, I said quietly. I simply let you believe your own fiction. It's called active camouflage. You learn it when you spend 4 decades in hostile territory. You played along beautifully. Colonel Costa stepped forward with handcuffs. Eleanor tried to speak, to plead, but no coherent words emerged. Marco cursed in Serbian, his composure shattered. They were taken away in separate vehicles, the diesel engines fading down the Cypress Line drive. The villa fell silent except for the sound of bees working the lavender and the distant bells from the village church marking the hour. The Swiss accounts Eleanor thought she'd been building were actually controlled by a trust I'd established 30 years ago. She'd had viewing access only, a window into assets she could never touch. Every transfer she'd made had been reversible with my authorization. The moment she was arrested, I executed the reversal protocols. $2.7 million in trafficking proceeds were frozen and seized as evidence. Her personal accounts were drained to pay restitution and legal fees. The villa, titled in my name alone, remained mine. I sold it 6 weeks later to a German couple who planned to restore the vineyards. The profit went into a foundation supporting anti-trafficking operations in the Mediterranean. I kept only what I needed for a modest apartment in Florence, close to the Arno, where the air smells of river water and old stone. Eleanor was sentenced to 14 years in an Italian prison. Marco received 18. The trafficking network collapsed within a month, 9 additional arrests across 4 countries. I testified twice, once in Rome and once in Geneva. Both times I wore my old diplomatic uniform, the one with the service ribbons from postings in dangerous places. The prosecutors called me a hero. I corrected them. I was simply a man who understood the value of patience and the mechanics of consequence. Every morning now, I walk along the Arno with a newspaper and an espresso from the corner bar. The cup is thick ceramic, chipped at the rim, warm against my palms. I read the international section carefully, tracking the movement of power and money and lies. Old habits. The apartment is small, 2 rooms and a narrow kitchen, but the windows face east and catch the early light. I sleep well now. No more counting hours, no more satellite phones, no more dead man's switches. The garden here is a window box with rosemary and basil. I tend it carefully, trimming the dead growth, encouraging new shoots. The shears are small, lightweight, nothing like the heavy steel I used in Tuscany. But the principle remains the same. You identify what needs to be cut away. You make the cut cleanly. You don't hesitate. People sometimes ask if I regret marrying Eleanor, if I blame myself for not seeing what she was. I tell them the truth. She taught me a valuable lesson about the difference between patience and weakness. Patience is strategic. Weakness is assuming others share your boundaries. I was patient. She mistook it for senility. That was her failure, not mine. The rosemary is blooming now, tiny purple flowers that smell of mountains and clean air. I trim them back, keeping the plant compact and productive. In the distance, church bells mark the hour. Everything grows toward light or dies in shadow. I chose light. Eleanor chose the other path. The garden doesn't care either way. It just keeps growing. If you believe that justice isn't given, it's enforced, make sure you subscribe and let me know where you're tuning in from. Let's show the world that quiet men are the most dangerous when provoked. Sometimes we suffer in silence, but when we finally speak, we change the laws. We are here to arm each other with the knowledge to survive the betrayal and rebuild the empire. Keep your eyes open, trust your gut, and remember that every decision you make is a brick in your legacy. Build it strong.